Hello, Dr. Roger Brome, and today's psych clip is going to be on psychomotor degradation. Psychomotor degradation is really a response to fatigue. I'm not talking about it in other contexts, medical contexts. I'm just really talking about it in terms of psychomotor performance and the impact that fatigue has on psychomotor skill and its actual proficiency. Um, Psychomotor is really misunderstood a lot. Most of the time people think in terms of like the brain and the central nervous system is the executive, and that the motor responses are purely directed solely by this executive function, and that's not really true. We know that instincts and the psychomotor feedback loop is very, very important to understand in terms of actually navigating a space and manipulating tools and those kinds of things. So in talking about the feedback loop, an example of disengaging the feedback loop is, for example, if you were to anesthetize your fingers, so that your hands were completely numb and you had no feeling in them, and then you were going to try and use your keyboard to, communicate a message in email or something like that, you'd find that it's absolutely difficult to have this happen in a message that goes top down. There is a bottom up process by which your fingers and the way that you navigate space is also psychomotor. And so you have to develop all of your skills in your exercises and in your training in a particular way so that you can bring those psychomotor levels up to the highest level of proficiency as possible. If you like this content so far, subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video. That will help me to make more videos. So I want to talk a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom was an educator that had three domains of learning. One of them was cognitive, so purely thinking. One of them was affective, so it was things like valuing or the way that people feel about them. And then the last domain was psychomotor. And psychomotor skill is very, very important in jobs that involve the manipulation of tools and technology. As a firefighter instructor, psychomotor skills were a main part of the training that we did in academy and also in in-service training. So I know a little bit about this from not only the practical side, but also bringing this into the performance of strength athletes and strength training. The psychomotor skill for an Olympic lifter needs to be higher than the psychomotor skill of, let's say, a power lifter. Strongman, it seems to me, or CrossFit seems to hit kind of in that middle area where there's a certain amount of just psychomotor power and strength that's needed, but at the same time there's a high level of technical skill and fine motor skill that is going to play into this, and this is really important to understand in your training. As fatigue increases, the first thing that a person loses is their fine motor skills. So their ability to manipulate things with their fingers, and the fine motor technique, like in complex movements, keeping your shoulders in the right place, getting out of position is one of those things that's a lot more likely the more fatigued you get, because you start to lose fine motor performance skill, and then subsequent to that you start losing gross motor performance skill. So if you have one of those leg days where you go in and you really, really overreach, and that's the goal of that training, and you get exhausted to the point that walking feels like one of those baby giraffes on a nature program, or you find yourself bumping into things and basic bodily movements in space are awkward, you know that you have tapped your fine motor skills and gone into your gross motor skills at that point. So let's talk about really quickly the levels of psychomotor training. The first level of psychomotor training is considered set. That's how ready you are to actually do the movements that you're going to do. So those of you that do personal training, or you're kind of mentoring your new buddy in the gym and that kind of thing, there's a lot to this level of learning that they need to do. They just need to know how to even grasp the bar correctly, how to hold certain joints in certain positions. So all of these movements, like the basics of a squat, a deadlift, a bench press, all of those things are really how prepared they are physically and psychophysically to be able to do that. And you'll find sometimes mobility problems or different muscular coordination problems that really make some of these lifts quite wonky when they try to do them. But if you can get them to the level of the second level, which is guided response is really that ability for them to follow instructions. So what we used to do in the fire service, and is kind of a standard way of training, is you do the I do, we do, you do approach. That means that you show them piece by piece how to do the bench press and what the component parts of that. Don't get too detailed with it, because if you give them any more than, like a couple of cues, it will go overboard. But once you get them to do the basics of the bench press, show them, once you've shown them the basics, show them what it looks like in full speed. So this is what this does psychologically. It gives them the pieces and the parts, the puzzles, and then it shows them what the puzzle pieces look like when they're all together. This is a real important mental piece to put into their mind, because the goal of them is to take those and to make it their own. So guided response is you have them go down on the bench and you have them go step by step through the process. It's just with the bar, maybe a broomstick, whatever, until they have the movement right before you start actually loading the bar. And then the you do piece, so we've done I do, we do. Now you do is where you actually have them do all of the things. And maybe it's even a good idea to have them explain it back to you what they're doing, because actually if they have to verbalize while they do it, it improves their guided response up to a higher level and moving into the third level, which is called mechanism. Mechanism is doing all of the pieces correctly and coordinatedly. That doesn't mean that they don't have to still pay cognitive awareness to what they're doing with their bodies, but mechanism is the ability to actually do it with kind of some proficiency and to do it correctly. A complex overt response is when somebody can do a skill without having to be really guided, watched. They've actually developed enough expertise that you can cut them loose to go do their workouts on their own, and you're not really too concerned that they're putting themselves out of position or developing bad habits. And then adaptation is when somebody has developed the kind of skill in their overt response, that kind of expertise, where now they can actually complete a lift if they get out of position. Now, this is really, really an important part of the conjugate method of training, and switching up like versions of the squat and versions of the deadlift and versions of the bench press with different bars and so forth, is because we know that sports specificity will build that psychomotor track for perfect movement with the barbell on the sport specific lift. But the adaptation part is not trained. So if you're using dumbbell presses and you're using football bar presses and you're using inclines and declines and varying that bench press over time, what that does for you is it not only builds a more holistic strength, because you're hitting all angles of the muscles, and there's physiological evidence for why changing those angles is important. But from a psychomotor standpoint, it helps you to know more from these different angles what the absolute correct angle is on your sport-specific bench press. So doing it in a different position or in a different adapted position oftentimes helps to train the psychomotor skill for the correct position stronger. And then origination is finally that ability to do something in a kind of unorthodox way, a new creative way. And there's not a lot origination to powerlifting and strength training anymore, but you can see that as the sports have evolved, like strongman, if you compare the exercises and the tests done in strongman in the 1970s with what they're doing now, you can see more refinement of implements. You can see different things that have been considered, like the kinds of exercises that are valued better or make actually even better entertainment. So all of these things start to come into play. There's not a lot out there that hasn't been already thought of in terms of how to innovate new ways of training. But if you've gotten to the point where your adaptation is really high and you've trained that really high, then origination really is the next thing, where people start combining things like a special bar, bands and chains, and doing those kind of things. And sometimes it can get a little bit overboard, for sure. So going back to this, also the more and more that you train this adaptation level, now we're talking about automaticity at this point. I've heard it said that the best thing to do is that when you hit the platform, you should never have more than 2 cues in your head, and it's best to have only 1 cue in your head, and that is the one that you really, really need more than anything. So like for me, bench pressing, my biggest cues are belly up and tuck the elbows. Those are the 2 things that really, out of everything else, is really, really kind of an important psychomotor cue for me to make sure that I get into my better position. The reason why is because at the time you hit the platform, you should be so good at that lift that it's not like playing roulette or something, or gambling and hoping to get in the right position. You should have automaticity to that psychomotor skill, and through doing different kinds of adaptive exercises that emulate and kind of work around that bench press or whatever the lift it is, the squat, you have the ability that if you happen to miss your groove or get a little bit out of position, you can still use some raw strength and correct that into position. This comes down to really kind of cognitive capacity too. If you are not working enough into fatigue that it starts to impact you cognitively, then when it really comes to competition day, you're going to use up all of your cognitive capacity on trying to operate the psychomotor part from an executive perspective. Like the executive function of the brain is now supposed to be driving the movement. And if you think about those levels of psychomotor training, you're right back down into thinking in terms of guided response. Thinking about my cues. When you start to break down an automated skill back into its steps, that is a recipe for choking. And choking gets a powerlifter or a strength athlete out of position. And when you're fatigued, that is a recipe for injury. So that's what's important about psychomotor degradation, is the more and more fatigued you get, the more and more the fatigue will actually degrade the nervous system, degrade the muscular system in terms of just tearing it down, but it will also psychologically push you back cognitively in the psychomotor scheme of things, down in the levels of psychomotor proficiency from your automated realm back down into having to think too much about what you're doing. And at that point, your training is starting to go backwards for you. I hope you like this video. Again, subscribe, hit the bell if you like the video. I'm going to try and do more content like this. And again, trying to keep it as a site clip fairly brief. So thanks for viewing.